So in this next lecture series, what I want to do is not just rehearse the lecture on deconstruction that I gave yesterday, but to try to give a bit more guidance to those who might be struggling to know how to approach the paper that's due next week. The paper is only 3 to 5 pages, double-spaced. I don't want this to be a stressful thing for anybody. Some of you have already expressed that you're a little worried about how to go about starting the paper for 1, but also organizing your argument for 2. To those who are struggling, I encourage you to meet with me tomorrow if you'd like to. I also encourage you to write or call me. I encourage you to send me an opening paragraph or an idea that you have about what you'd like to do, and we can go from there in terms of corresponding about how to organize the paper, how to develop an argument, how to do a close reading. Because really that's what this paper is, an exercise in close reading, an exercise in learning how to write about how a work of literature works. Not evaluating its story, not learning how to summarize the story, not speculating about why a character does this or that, not investigating whether or not you like it, whether or not you think it's great literature. Well, although if you're a new critic, that does matter to you. But instead, really trying to pay close attention to how the words, how the plot, how the setting, how the ideas, how the text operates. Okay? So, I just want to run through a few examples of what might be interesting about Mrs. Dalloway to, let's say, a new critic, what might be interesting to a structuralist. I'm going to save deconstruction for the later videos since I'll be giving a lecture on it anyway. Okay. First, remember, in new criticism, the steps are pretty easy. Find a problem. That problem can be a paradox, can be an ambiguity, some sort of obscurity or enigma, a kind of tension, an example of irony, what have you. Okay, something that seems out of place, disjointed, initially confusing, but altogether, excuse me, altogether interesting and worth investigating. So finding the problem, showing that that problem actually forms a pattern in the text, it repeats itself in the text, either within one passage or across several shorter passages, and then showing that reading that pattern and understanding that pattern is actually key to understanding the novel. Okay. So I don't want you to, I'm going to be less concerned with that last step because you don't have a lot of space. But regardless, a new critic would try to show that that pattern is important, even if it doesn't explain the whole novel, is central to beginning to understand the novel, let's say. So the first hurdle to get over here would be to try to figure out what is a problem. I talked about this in an earlier video. I've talked about this in class, but it's really clear to me, especially when I asked the question, what are some problems in Mrs. Dalloway in class? I got the deer in the headlights look from a lot of you. So I want to just give maybe 3 examples of problems that stand out, and keep in mind that problems, again, are usually related to a paradox, related to an ambiguity, related to an enigma or obscurity that the new critic initially feels is somewhat out of place. Right? So one example of a problem might be the 2 times that Peter Walsh runs into Septimus Smith. Never introduces himself, doesn't know his name, or what have you. But nevertheless, the novel very carefully arranges 2 encounters between Septimus and Peter. The first occurs in the park, about a third of the way through the novel, I think, maybe halfway through the novel. And Peter reflects on Septimus and Rhesia as a young couple, right, and completely misreads their situation. Later in the novel, around page 147, I believe, it's after Septimus Smith has committed suicide. We get a break between that really enigmatic sentence, "So that was Dr. Holmes," on 147. We get a break, and then we have Peter Walsh saying to himself, the triumphs of civilization, as he watches the ambulance take away Septimus's body. There's certainly irony here. Right? Certainly some sort of tension between what Peter Walsh thinks he's seeing, what Septimus is experiencing, why the novel arranges both of those encounters, and the novel's ideas about things like the access that we have to others, our knowledge of others, right? But also things like the ability to forget the injury of others, okay? I mean, Peter Walsh is watching an ambulance, right? It doesn't even matter if it's Septimus or not rushing away in that ambulance. Nevertheless, what Peter Walsh so easily forgets, at least in that first sentence, is the injury that must be contained within it, right? Or the death that is in his presence, the potential death that's in his presence. Okay? That's a problem that could be investigated in a paper, really unpacked through a close reading of those two moments in the novel. Another one could be the phrase, "the leaden circles dissolved in the air." This phrase, or this sentence, recurs 4 times in the novel. I'll give you the page numbers even. Page 4, page 47, page 92, page 182 in this edition. What on earth does that mean? The leaden circles dissolved in air. Immediately we have a paradox of materiality here. We get the solidity of lead and the idea of dissolving, and also gas or air, right? Airiness, as it were. Okay. So we immediately get a kind of ambiguity, or even a paradox here, that is related to the way in which Big Ben interrupts, as its bells chime, how Big Ben interrupts the thoughts of these characters, or moves us from character to character, along the thread of that sound. But a new critic would want to really investigate what is at stake in that description. And what is this idea of dissolving solidity, right? This idea of ethereality or airiness. What does that have to do with what the novel thinks about time? What the novel has to say, or what it theorizes in relation to memory? Who knows, right? What it has to say about relationships with each other, right? What's going on in that recurring sentence? So if you were a new critic, you'd read the context in which that sentence comes up and try to make some kind of argument about all the competing energies that the novel is balancing and harmonizing in that one sentence. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Okay, so those are 2 examples. I could say dozens more if I had time. I don't want to bore you with them, although maybe you'd like to hear them. But where does one go from there? Right. Once you pick a problem, remember the second step is to track the pattern through the text, or to show it that there's a pattern even within the one passage you're focusing on. In both of those examples, I already showed you that second step too, right? That Peter Walsh and Peter Walsh meeting Septimus here and here form a pattern, or that the recurrence of that sentence forms a pattern. And so your work, if you were to write a paper about these problems, would be to reread those moments, to pay close attention to how they work, what they seem to have to do with anything, what competing meanings they balance and harmonize together. And then you would have to go through and organize your paper according to those moments. Keep in mind that a 3 to 5 page paper, I mean, you're probably only talking about a maximum of 7 or 8 paragraphs, one of which is your introduction, one of which is your conclusion. So map out your paper. What do you want to talk about in the first body paragraph, after you articulate the problem and your argument in your first paragraph? What do you want to talk about in your first paragraph? What passage do you want to analyze? Right? What facet of the problem do you want to investigate and demonstrate for us? And what about the second paragraph, the third, the fourth, the fifth? and then in your conclusion trying to wrap up as best you can what will really be a kind of incomplete argument for you. Okay. That's how you write a paper, whether it's 3 pages or whether, as I did, you write a 350, 400-page dissertation. You map it out, paragraph by paragraph. You anticipate what you want to say. You plan what you're going to write. And it will be so much easier, because you'll never be lost. Even if you're struggling to write one paragraph, you know what you said before, you know where you want to go, and you're going to eventually break that writer's block. Okay? Right. So that applies to to structuralism, which I'm about to talk about now too. Okay. So a structuralist approach to literature is also going to involve close reading, paying very close attention to the text, but paying close attention to it in relation to some sort of system of codes and conventions, right? For a good example of this, go back and look at Chapman again. How does Chapman analyze his examples of literature in that chapter about plot? Right? How does he do it? How does he do it? Go back and look. Right? He doesn't spend a lot of time grueling, in a grueling fashion over the symbolic content. That's a stupid way to put it. Over the content of the passages he's analyzing. Instead, he pays attention to how those passages line up with these categories involving plot structure. Right? So, in that sense, the works of literature he analyzes are exemplary illustrations of those tropes and codes and conventions of plot. And so if we're analyzing Mrs. Dalloway, what you might want to do is isolate a passage or 2 or 3 that gives us some kind of insight into how, right, Woolf arranges her plot, how the setting influences and informs what's going on in the novel, how the narrative perspective helps us move between settings, move between minds, move between characters, how Woolf creates her characters, right? Because we have different kinds of characters in this novel. We have major characters like Clarissa, a mad character like Septimus, minor characters like Sally Seton, but also characters that show up like one time, right? But are yet named. Right. So what is Woolf's system? Or what system of characterization can we use or think about in order to make sense of how Woolf goes about doing it? Okay. So that is one way to approach how to do structuralist analysis. Another way to do it is really to do what Natalia Wright does in the very first article we read a couple weeks ago. Right. She doesn't pay attention to codes and conventions of narrative. What does she do? She sets up her own grid of intelligibility, according to which we can approach the novel and try to make meaning of it. She treats it as if it were a painting, right? And maps out sort of 4 groupings of characters, 4 groupings of psychological themes that she then maps onto those 4 characters. She maps out 4 different color schemes that also map onto those characters. She spends a little time investigating how those categories or groups interact with each other in the novel. Right? In other words, she treats the novel as if it were language unto itself and gives an account or an inventory of the various features of the novel, the structural features of the novel that help us make sense of what's happening in it as a composition. Okay. So, what might you do if you wanted to do a structuralist approach to Mrs. Dalloway? You might come up, usually approaching the novel in order to make some sort of inventory is really one of the best ways to do it, right? So giving an inventory of all the techniques that Woolf uses for moving from mind to mind. In that case, you're not digging deep into passages to unearth their figurative meaning or thematic significance, but instead, you're doing something quite mechanistic. Just looking at the bare bones structuralist mode by which the novel moves us from character to character. How does the narrator do it? Right? That's one thing you can do. You might look at a passage or two, using Chapman as a model, with an eye to how the plot is arranged. Again, remember Chapman's distinction between story and plot. Story is just what happens. You can tell it in an innumerable number of ways. But plot is a specific arrangement of that story, right? So asking questions and analyzing how the plot is arranged in one or two passages and arranged in interesting ways. That might be something you want to think about. You might, Parker talks about this a little bit in his chapter, you might instead map out various binaries that actually act as support beams in this novel, right? So life and death, rising and falling. We'll see that deconstructivists will do this only in order to topple that edifice, right? To topple it and show that really those binaries are false binaries, right? That on the one hand, they're value-laden, they form a hierarchy, but at certain points in the text, that hierarchy will switch and form a kind of undecidable opposition between life and death, or rising and falling. Structuralists will not be interested in doing that. A structuralist will instead show how all of these binaries help structure or help the novel organize its approach to characters, right? So characters will be, in some sense, divvied up according to life, death, according to rising, falling, or other binaries one might pick out. The plot may be organized according to rhythms of rising and falling, life and death, or some other meaningful feature of the novel might be organized according to those binary oppositions. Okay, that's something else you could do if you were a structuralist. Okay, so if that's something you're interested in doing, run your idea by me, and I can help you try to work out whether it seems more formalist or structuralist. And really, at the end of the day, the distinction between those two matters far less to me than your ability to really hone in on a topic or a problem and develop a close interpretation, as opposed to a summary of what happens, as opposed to an account of how it makes you feel, as opposed to a speculative account of why a character did that, this or that. Okay? So, all right. So I hope that helps, right? I spoke a little bit about how to organize your paper, how to think about it as a map of paragraphs. Talked a little bit about various problems or topics you might pick up on. And other than that, you're going to have to really rely on the articles that we've been reading as models for how to treat the evidence that you extract from the text. Okay. One little tip. If you quote several sentences from the novel, it's a good idea not to just let it speak for itself. Right? Don't just quote a passage from the novel as if it's perfectly clear that it backs up what you're saying. Instead, quote a passage from the novel and spend some time unpacking what's significant or interesting about it in regard to, your topic or or the problem at hand. Okay, that's the one tip I'll give you as we move forward. Also, keep in mind, I am expecting this to be a draft. Not a rough draft. I want it to be as polished as you can make it. But you will have an opportunity in the final assignment of this class, a portfolio, to revise one of your critical papers. Okay? So keep that in mind too. All right. So this is my second attempt to record this video. It's much shorter than the first attempt, and I think more direct and hopefully more useful. And from here on out, I'm going to turn to deconstruction, a lecture that I've actually mostly written, and we'll go from there. Okay? All right. See you soon.